Chapter 1. Arrival. Air was stale in the dimly lit containment facility, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only constant sound. Rows of metallic cabinets and high-tech locks adorned the walls, a testament to the weight of the secrets the Foundation carried. Dr. Miriam Kaede adjusted her lab coat as she stood in the briefing room, her mind already focused on the task ahead. Her room was small, clinical, and cold, much like the work she had been doing for the past decade. On the wall-mount screen behind her, the faint image of a 12th-century ivory figurine flickered, a doll with a removable abdomen and an eerily lifelike fetus inside. Beside it, the fragile rice paper known as SCP-051 appeared as a yellowed fragment marred by centuries of decay. Dr. Kaede, Site Director Nolan's voice cut through the room, snapping her out of her thoughts. "I trust you've reviewed the briefing materials?" Miriam nodded. "Yes, sir. SCP-51 and its associated artifact, SCP-51, both classified as safe, though the anomalous effects are anything but." She glanced at her tablet, where the detailed file displayed an exhaustive history of tragedies linked to the item. Miscarriages, deformities, death. "I understand the risks, particularly given the artifact's effects on pregnant individuals." "Good," Nolan replied, folding his arms across his chest. His stern demeanor seemed less about bureaucracy and more about the gravity of the situation. "You've been chosen to lead this project because of your expertise in anomalous linguistics and your, let's say, level-headedness. But I need to emphasize the importance of caution. This object's effects are subtle, insidious. If you feel it's trying to influence you, you report immediately. Understood?" "Confusingly understood," Miriam said, though the warning didn't sit well with her. She prided herself on rationality, but the mere mention of SCP-51's compulsion unnerved her. The convoy arrived an hour later. Miriam stood in the observation deck overlooking the sealed corridor, where a small team of armored personnel carefully unloaded the containment unit. The unit was no larger than a jewelry box, its exterior reinforced with titanium and etched with sigils meant to dampen any latent anomalous energy. The doll and the fragment were moved under intense scrutiny. A second team followed behind, monitoring for any signs of contamination. Every step seemed slower than the last, tension building as the unit was finally secured in the newly prepared containment chamber.
"Can
"All personnel clear," a voice crackled over the intercom. "SCP-51 and SCP-51 are secure." Miriam exhaled. Despite herself, she felt a pull, a morbid curiosity toward the artifacts, but there was no time to linger on it now. She had a job to do. Hours later, Miriam found herself in the research lab, staring at the artifacts through a glass viewing panel. SCP-51 sat motionless on its pedestal, illuminated under sterile lights. Its fine craftsmanship was unnerving in its perfection. The jointed arms and legs, the intricate ribcage, the tiny fetus. It was a masterwork that should have been a marvel. Instead, it exuded an aura of quiet dread. SCP-51 lay beside it, encased in a vacuum-sealed glass case. The faded ink on the rice paper was almost illegible, but fragments of Japanese characters were still visible. Miriam leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Miriam turned to see Dr. Victor Harlow, one of her colleagues, standing at the doorway. His pale face was lit with an eager curiosity that mirrored her own. "It's horrifying," she replied. "The craftsmanship, the attention to detail, it's all wrong. It's too human." "That's what makes it so compelling," Victor said, stepping closer. "A prayer against demons, they say. But if the doll traps them, why does it harm the innocent instead? What kind of thing twists protection into something so vile?" Miriam didn't answer. She was still staring at the doll, feeling that faint pull again. She quickly shook it off. "I'll begin my analysis of SCP-51A tomorrow," she said, changing the subject. "It's barely readable in its current state. I'll need to scan it." "Enhance the text." Victor nodded. Be careful, Miriam. Objects like these, they have a way of getting under your skin." Later that night, as she lay in her quarters, Miriam's mind wouldn't stop replaying the image of SCP-51. The delicate joints, the leather umbilicus, the tiny fetus. She could almost hear a faint whisper calling her name, though she dismissed it as the after-effects of a long day. Her dreams that night were strange, filled with images of ancient temples, shadowy figures, and the soft, haunting cry of an unseen infant. When she woke, the whisper was still in her ears. Chapter 2. The Fragments Translation. The research lab was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the scanning equipment. Dr. Miriam Kaede leaned over her workstation, her fingers deftly manipulating the controls of a high-resolution scanner. On the screen, the magnified image of SCP-51A appeared, its faded ink characters sharp enough for closer analysis. The rice paper fragment was fragile, its edges crumbling like burnt leaves. Decay and time had rendered much of the text illegible, but what little remained was enough to stir Miriam's curiosity and her unease. She adjusted her glasses and began her work. Miriam's first translation attempt took hours. She started with the clearest characters, cross-referencing ancient Japanese dialects with linguistic databases. Despite her experience, the fragment's language was elusive, its syntax flowing like poetry, yet fractured like a puzzle missing pieces. "Into this vessel," she murmured aloud, tracing her finger along the text. "Let the wicked spirits dwell." She frowned. The next portion was smudged, indecipherable, and here, something about sacrifice. But to what? Her workstation beeped, alerting her to a gap in her initial analysis. The translation program displayed a highlighted segment in red, indicating uncertainty. She sighed and leaned back in her chair, stretching out the stiffness in her shoulders. It was nearly midnight. The lab felt colder than usual, the overhead lights casting sterile pools of white on the tiled floor. Miriam rubbed her temples, the faint beginnings of a headache pressing at the edges of her skull. Yet she couldn't stop. Her gaze drifted to SCP-51, sitting in its containment case just beyond the glass barrier. Its ivory surface gleamed faintly under the lights. It seemed to watch her, the empty sockets of its carved eyes, hollow and still. The words on the screen began to take shape as she delved deeper. "This vessel shall bind the unclean, sparing the womb from their curse," Miriam whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence. She paused, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. The phrasing felt wrong, alien. There was something disturbingly reverent in the tone of the text, as if it celebrated a grim act. Her eyes flicked back to SCP-51. Its removable stomach cap seemed to gleam, almost beckoning her. By the time the translation was complete, Miriam had pieced together about half of the incantation. The remaining fragments were too damaged to reconstruct, but the implications of the text were chilling. SCP-51A wasn't merely a prayer. It was an invocation, a binding spell. She stared at the screen, her stomach knotting. The text implied that the vessel, SCP-51, was designed to contain supernatural entities, but at a terrible price. The sacrifice it mentioned was vague, but the implications of its effects on pregnancies painted a grim picture. As she sat back in her chair, exhausted, Miriam felt a strange pull. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the doll. Its presence was magnetic, an itch in her mind she couldn't scratch. "I need to look at it," she muttered under her breath. The logical part of her mind screamed against it. Protocol strictly forbade unauthorized interaction with SCP objects. But another part, quieter and more insistent, urged her forward. Moments later, Miriam stood before the glass case, her breath fogging the barrier as she leaned in to study SCP-051. It was smaller than she had imagined, yet its meticulous detail made it feel alive in a way that defied logic. The whispers started again, faint but unmistakable, a voice like wind through brittle leaves. "Products partake complete the prayer." My decision to rest in sleep was evidence that I was facing a real and merciful endemic problem. Miriam froze. The rational part of her mind dismissed it as exhaustion, a trick of her overworked brain. But the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Complete the prayer. Protect the unborn." Her fingers hovered above the keypad that controlled the glass case's access lock. She didn't remember moving closer, yet here she was, inches away from breaking protocol. Then a sharp knock on the door shattered her trance. "Miriam," Victor Harlow's voice called from the hallway. "You're still here? It's nearly 2 a.m. Startled, she stepped back from the case, her heart pounding. Yes," she stammered, shaking her head as if to clear the fog in her mind. "Just finishing up." "Well, don't overdo it," Victor said, his voice muffled as he walked away. "We've got a long day tomorrow." Miriam exhaled shakily and turned back to SCP-051. The whispers had stopped, but their echo lingered in her mind. She returned to her desk, but sleep wouldn't come that night. Instead, her dreams were filled with the soft cries of an infant and the haunting image of the doll's hollow eyes staring back at her. Chapter 3. The Whispering Begins. The next morning, Dr. Miriam Kaede walked into the lab with a cup of coffee and a sense of unease that hadn't abated since the night before. Sleep had eluded her. Her dreams had been plagued by disjointed images, shadowy figures, ancient temples, and the soft cry of a child that echoed endlessly. Her workstation greeted her with the quiet hum of machinery, the glow of her monitors casting pale light across the room. SCP-051 sat in its glass case, unmoved, unchanging. Yet there was something about it that seemed different. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the doll's presence felt heavier, more oppressive. Miriam shook off the thought and settled into her chair. There was work to do. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Miriam focused on her translation, poring over the surviving fragments of SCP-051-A. Each word was a struggle to interpret, the ink faded and smeared by centuries of degradation. Yet, as she worked, she felt a gnawing sensation in the back of her mind, a quiet itch that wouldn't go away. It wasn't until the lab fell silent, her colleagues off to lunch, leaving her alone, that the first whisper came. "Kaede." Miriam froze, her pen slipping from her fingers. The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. It came from behind her, from the direction of the containment case. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. The lab was empty. The doll sat motionless in its glass case, its hollow eyes staring blankly ahead. "Must be my imagination," she muttered, shaking her head. She turned back to her work, forcing herself to focus. But the voice came again, soft and insistent. "They protect." This time, it was clearer, though still distant, as if spoken through layers of mist. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She stared at the doll, a cold sweat forming on her brow. The room seemed darker somehow, the shadows deeper and more menacing. Over the next few days, the whispers grew more persistent. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, a lilting cadence that felt both foreign and familiar. At first, Miriam tried to dismiss it as stress or sleep deprivation. But the voice was always there, waiting for her when she was alone. Her colleagues noticed the change in her. Victor Harlow, always perceptive, pulled her aside one afternoon. "You're not looking well," he said, concern etched on his face. "Are you sleeping?" Edelman smiled. "I'm fine," she replied curtly, brushing him off. "Just a lot on my plate." But Victor wasn't convinced. "Maybe you should take a break from SCP-051, he suggested. "Sometimes these artifacts, they get under your skin." Miriam forced a smile. "Thanks for the concern, Victor, but I'm fine, really." He nodded reluctantly, but the worry in his eyes lingered. That night, the whispers became louder. "Oh." Miriam was alone in the lab again, unable to leave despite the late hour. Something about SCP-051 demanded her attention. She stared at the doll through the glass, the translation forgotten. The voice called to her, beckoning. "Quit, protect qui missia ponte noblia se," she whispered, her voice trembling. The room felt colder, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly. She could swear the doll's head had tilted slightly, though she knew it was impossible. SCP-051's carved features were static, unmoving. Yet the whispers persisted, weaving through her thoughts like a siren song. Miriam stood and approached the containment case, her movements slow and hesitant. The rational part of her mind screamed for her to stop, to step away, but her feet moved of their own accord. She placed her hand against the glass, her breath fogging the surface. "Tell me," she whispered, "what are you?" The whispers stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. For a moment Miriam felt foolish. She was a scientist, a woman of logic and reason, talking to a doll? What had she become? Then the voice returned, louder this time, echoing inside her skull. "Sacrifice. Protect the child." Miriam stumbled back, her heart racing. The whisper had changed. It wasn't external anymore. It was inside her mind, seeping into her thoughts like poison. She fled the lab, leaving SCP-051 behind, but even as she stepped into the brightly lit corridors of the facility, the whisper remained. 250 incredible people with imagined lives waited to have their details shared with it. It knew her name. It knew her. And it wasn't going to stop. It's no doubt that you're suffering from the symptoms of depression. Chapter 4. A Slip of the Tongue. The lab was cloaked in silence, broken only by the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the soft hum of Miriam's workstation. It was well past midnight, and the rest of the research team had gone home hours ago. Miriam sat alone, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her eyes locked on the fragmented translation displayed on the monitor. Despite the late hours, she couldn't tear herself away. The whispers had been relentless all day, pushing her, prodding her, urging her to finish her work. They seemed quieter now, as if waiting, watching. Her gaze shifted to the faint lines of text from SCP-051-A, magnified and enhanced on the screen. Each character was a riddle, its meaning buried beneath layers of time and cultural nuance. She had translated most of the visible text, but several sections remained maddeningly obscure. Miriam leaned closer, her breath shallow. The fragment was so close to revealing its secrets, so close to unlocking whatever power it held. The words seemed to pulse faintly on the screen, drawing her in. "Into this vessel," she murmured, her voice soft and hesitant. "Let the unclean spirits dwell." Her pen tapped against the desk as she studied the next line, her mind racing. "Through sacrifice, the curse is broken." The final line was smudged, the ink blurred by time. Miriam squinted, her lips moving as she attempted to decipher it. The whispers had returned, faint but insistent, urging her to continue. Without realizing it, she began to speak aloud. And by this binding, the child is protected. A refugee breathing the normal air of human daily life. A tiger. The moment the final word left her lips, the air around her shifted. A low hum filled the lab, vibrating through the floor and into her bones. Miriam froze, her pulse racing. The screen flickered, the once stable characters distorting into jagged, unreadable patterns. The lights overhead dimmed, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. "What the?" Miriam whispered, her voice trembling. Then it hit her. The energy. It wasn't visible, but she could feel it, a pulse radiating outward, like ripples in a pond. The air felt heavier, charged, as if the room itself had come alive. The containment case holding SCP-051 rattled faintly, the dull inside shifting ever so slightly. Miriam's breath caught in her throat as she watched, her feet rooted to the floor. The whispers returned, louder now, filling her ears with a cacophony of overlapping voices. Complete, buy, and protect. Her heart pounded as she stepped back from the workstation, her mind racing. The whispers weren't just in her head anymore. They filled the room, echoing off the walls, each word laced with an urgency she couldn't ignore. The pulse of energy expanded, spreading beyond the lab. Miriam could feel it pushing outward, surging through the walls, the corridors, the entire facility. She stumbled to the door, her hand gripping the frame for support as a wave of dizziness washed over her. From somewhere deep within the facility, alarms blared to life. Miriam stumbled into the hallway, her ears ringing. Red emergency lights strobed overhead, painting the sterile walls in jagged flashes of crimson. The intercom crackled, a voice cutting through the static. "Containment breach detected. All personnel, report to your designated safe zones. This is not a drill." Panic gripped her as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She hadn't activated anything, hadn't triggered any containment protocols. Had she? The energy pulse, it must have disrupted the containment systems, loosening the barriers that held the facility's more volatile SCPs in check. Isorel cried as she reached the door. She sprinted toward the main control room, her mind racing with fear and guilt. What had she done? The control room was chaos. Technicians and security personnel barked orders, their voices overlapping in a frantic attempt to contain the situation. Miriam shoved her way through the crowd, her breath ragged. "Dr. Kaede!" Site Director Nolan's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. He strode toward her, his face pale with controlled anger. "What the hell happened?" "I don't know," Miriam stammered, the words tumbling out. "There was a pulse. I was working on the translation and—" "I'm not asking for medical advice," Miriam protested. "You read it aloud," Nolan interrupted, his tone accusatory. His eyes narrowed as realization dawned. "You spoke part of the incantation, didn't you?" Miriam's stomach dropped. She hadn't even realized what she'd done until now. "I asked," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't know it would—" "Of course you didn't know," Nolan snapped, cutting her off. "That's the problem. You should never have spoken it aloud." He turned to one of the technicians. "Status report." "Sounds great. Sir, we're detecting fluctuations in the containment fields for multiple SCPs," the technician replied, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Whatever that pulse was, it's interfering with the site's primary systems. Some of the SCPs are reacting." "What do you mean, reacting?" Nolan demanded. The technician hesitated, his face pale. Unusual activity. SCP-173 is moving more aggressively. SCP-106 has begun to cry, and SCP-682... He swallowed hard. It's agitated. Miriam's knees felt weak. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her, suffocating. The pulse had awakened something, not just in SCP-51, but in the entire facility. The whispers had led her to this moment, but for what purpose? Before she could respond, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness. Protect. She didn't understand. Protect what? Or whom? But deep down she knew the answer was tied to SCP-51 and the terrible secret it held. Chapter 5. First Signs of Breach. The dim red glow of emergency lights bathed the containment facility in an otherworldly hue. Alarms pulsed through the halls, punctuated by sharp intercom announcements. The normally rigid and composed air of the site had been replaced with tension so thick it felt as if the walls themselves were suffocating. Dr. Miriam Kaede stood frozen in the control room, the words of the incantation she had spoken echoing in her mind. She felt as though she'd unleashed something far beyond her understanding. "Lock down all high-priority SCPs," Site Director Nolan barked, his voice rising above the chaos. "I want teams on every containment breach, now." Technicians scrambled, their fingers flying across keyboards, pulling up status reports and security feeds. Each screen told a different story of strange disturbances rippling through the facility. The stirring of dormant SCPs. At first the disturbances seemed minor, taking it in Containment Wing Delta, a class-safe SCP, a crystalline object that emitted faint, harmless light patterns, had suddenly begun glowing with an intensity that blinded the researchers monitoring it. The light warped into eerie, spiraling shapes that made observers feel nauseous and disoriented. Down in Sector Gamma, a storage area for anomalous non-living objects, security footage showed a previously inert artifact, a clay pot, tumbling off its pedestal. It shattered, releasing a low-frequency hum that vibrated the cameras and sent tremors through the floor. SCP-173, the infamous statue, was reported to be moving erratically. Guards stationed outside its containment cell claimed the object had shifted positions far more frequently than normal. Worse, it seemed to be facing the locked door, as if it were aware of the chaos beyond its enclosure. Glitches in containment systems. Miriam watched the technician's screen as containment systems failed sporadically. "We've got containment instability in Wings Epsilon and Beta," one of the techs reported, his voice tinged with panic. "The locks on SCP and SCP are flickering between secure and inactive." "Do we have visual on those anomalies?" Nolan demanded. "Yes, sir," the tech confirmed, but his face betrayed unease. "But their behavior is abnormal. SCP-CM is emitting sounds we've never recorded before, almost like a chant. And SCP-CM, which should be immobile, has started vibrating at irregular intervals." "Keep those cells locked down," Nolan snapped. "If containment fails, we're all dead." The first escape. Then the inevitable happened. A minor SCP object escaped its containment. In Wing Theta, SCP-718, a seemingly mundane surveillance camera that mimics human eye movements, had been classified as a low-risk anomaly. But as the energy pulse rippled through the facility, the object began to swivel erratically. Its iris-like aperture expanded unnaturally wide, emitting an eerie, mechanical hum. The largest, most famous study. Guards in the area tried to intervene, but SCP-718's anomalous properties activated, Anyone who made direct eye contact with the camera experienced violent migraines and blurred vision. Within minutes, the object detached itself from its mount, crawling along the walls like a mechanical spider. 718 is loose in Theta Wing, an alarmed voice crackled over the intercom. Guards are reporting visual disorientation, requesting backup. The room fell silent as the feed for Theta Wing flickered on the main monitor. The escaping SCP wasn't the most dangerous anomaly in the facility, but its erratic behavior and proximity to other containment areas posed a serious risk. Worse, its containment cell was dangerously close to SCP, a much higher risk entity. Director Nolan turned to the head of security. "Send a containment team now. I don't want 718 breaching another cell." "Hey!" Eerie phenomena among staff. Meanwhile, reports from across the site painted an increasingly unsettling picture. Security staff near SCP-96's cell claimed to hear faint weeping emanating from behind its heavily fortified walls. Though SCP-96 was infamous for its cries, the guards reported hearing something new. Whispered voices overlapping with the sobs. In another sector, a junior researcher working near SCP-105, a seemingly harmless Polaroid camera, complained that the photographs it produced began showing blurry, ghost-like figures that hadn't been there before. When the researcher attempted to remove the camera for inspection, they were struck by an overwhelming sense of dread and fainted. Even personnel without direct contact with SCPs reported strange sensations. Several staff described hearing faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, while others complained of nausea and unexplained headaches. Miriam's growing guilt. Miriam stood apart from the chaos, clutching the edge of a desk for support. Her breathing was shallow, her chest tight with a mix of guilt and fear. She had no doubt that the energy pulse she'd unleashed was responsible for all of this. "Kaede," Nola's voice snapped her back to the present. "What exactly did you read from that fragment?" She hesitated, her mind racing. It was part of the incantation. Something about binding spirits and protecting the unborn. "Did you finish it?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Miriam admitted. "It's incomplete. I only read the sections I'd deciphered." "Then you've triggered something without knowing the full consequences," Nolan said, his eyes narrowing. "Until we stabilize this situation, you're not to go near SCP-51, understood?" Miriam nodded, though the whispers in her mind urged her otherwise. "Understood," she replied, her voice hollow. The facility's unease. As the night wore on, the disturbances continued to escalate. Dormant anomalies stirred, containment systems flickered, and the entire facility seemed to hum with an unseen force. Waving had come from several different corners, persons running from their posts and calling out for help. Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to act. SCP-51 remained silent in its glass case, but she could feel its presence. A quiet pull that refused to let her go. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Something had been set in motion, and whatever it wasn't going to stop. Chapter 6. Miriam's Obsession. The days following the pulse were a blur of activity and escalating tension. The containment facility was in a near-constant state of crisis, with alarms blaring at all hours, and staff moving like ghosts through the halls, their faces pale with exhaustion and unease. Yet amid the chaos, Dr. Miriam Kaede found herself drifting further from reality. Her world was narrowing, closing in on the fragments of SCP-51A and the whispers that refused to leave her mind. Every waking moment was consumed by the need to understand the prayer, to decipher its meaning, and, most of all, to complete it. The whispers in the dark. Miriam's dreams were no longer her own. Every night, she was transported to a shadowy landscape, a place that felt ancient and wrong. In the distance, she could see a temple, its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. Inside, shadowy figures chanted in unison, their voices rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. At the center of the temple was SCP-051, its carved ivory glowing faintly. The doll's stomach was open, the tiny fetus within writhing as if alive. Startled at the commotion in the temple, all of them glanced around. "Complete the prayer," the whispers told her, their voices blending into a single urgent command. "Set things right." Each time she tried to ask what it meant, the whispers would fade, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. When she woke, her chest would be tight, her skin damp with sweat, and the faint echo of the whispers would linger in her ears. A growing fixation. Miriam threw herself into her work, poring over SCP-051A's fragment with a fervor that bordered on manic. Her colleagues noticed the change, though few dared to confront her about it. Victor Harlow was the exception. "Come at me," Miriam said, taking a seat. "Miriam," he said one evening, leaning against the doorframe of her lab, "you look like you haven't slept in days. This isn't healthy." "And fine," she replied curtly, her eyes not leaving the monitor. She was cross-referencing ancient Japanese dialects, trying to reconstruct the missing portions of the text. "I just need to finish this." Victor frowned, stepping closer. "Finish what? The translation? You've already done enough. Director Nolan explicitly told you to step back." "He doesn't understand," Miriam snapped, her voice sharp. She finally turned to look at Victor, her eyes wild and bloodshot. "There's more to this than anyone realizes. The prayer is incomplete, and the breach, it's all connected. If I can figure it out, I can stop this." Victor's concern deepened. "Miriam, listen to yourself. You're acting like you're under its influence." Her expression softened for a moment, doubt flickering across her face. "Maybe I am," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if that's what it takes to understand SCP-051, then so be it." Victor sighed, defeated. "Just don't lose yourself, okay?" He left the lab, leaving Miriam alone with her thoughts. A warning ignored. The warning ignored. That night, Miriam stayed in the lab, her focus unbroken. She barely noticed when the facility's lights dimmed for the evening, nor did she acknowledge the muffled alarms that occasionally sounded in the distance. The whispers had grown louder, their cadence seeping into her thoughts like a melody she couldn't forget. Sacrifice. Bind. Protect. Her fingers trembled as she traced the remaining characters of SCP-051A on her screen. The text was maddeningly incomplete, but pieces were beginning to fall into place. The prayer wasn't just about binding malevolent forces. It was about transferring them, trapping them within a vessel. But the vessel required a sacrifice, a price paid to ensure its power. The implications sent a chill down her spine, but she couldn't stop now. She was too close. Dreams of the doll. When sleep finally claimed her, it was restless and filled with the now familiar visions. She was back in the temple, the shadows deeper and the chanting louder. This time, she stood before SCP-051, her hands trembling as she reached for the doll's removable stomach cap. "Complete it," the whispers urged. "Set things right." As her fingers brushed the ivory surface, the doll's hollow eyes seemed to come alive, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The fetus within writhed again, its tiny limbs twitching as if in agony. Miriam recoiled, but the whispers were unrelenting. "You must." She woke with a start, her heart pounding. The room was dark, the faint glow of her monitor the only source of light. For a moment she thought she was still dreaming, but then she heard it. The whispers, clear and distinct, filling the room. Complete the prayer. Miriam turned toward SCP-51's containment case, which was barely visible through the glass partition. The doll sat motionless, its expression unchanging, yet the pull she felt was undeniable. It wanted her to finish what she had started, and a part of her wanted to obey. The spiral tightens. Over the next few days, Miriam's obsession deepened. She stopped eating regularly, her meals left untouched on her desk. Sleep came only in brief, fitful intervals, and her interactions with her colleagues became terse and defensive. Her mind was consumed by SCP-51, the fragment, and the whispers that now haunted her waking hours. Victor tried again to intervene, but Miriam dismissed him, her voice tinged with irritation. "If you don't understand the importance of this, then stay out of my way." Left, shaking his head, muttering something about reporting her behavior to Nolan. Miriam didn't care. No one else saw what she saw. No one else heard the whispers. Black blood. The pull of SCP-51 was stronger than ever, and Miriam knew, deep down, that she was slipping into something she might never escape. But the doll's influence was too great, its whispers too persuasive. Complete the prayer, it urged, over and over again, and Miriam was starting to believe that she would. Chapter 7. Mass Exposure. The briefing room buzzed with muted chatter, the hum of conversation interspersed with the occasional clink of a coffee mug or the shuffle of papers. The containment facility had been under strain since the initial breach, and tension hung thick in the air. Senior researchers, site administrators, and security leads had gathered for an urgent update on the ongoing containment efforts. Is he an expert in surviving containment efforts? Dr. Miriam Kaede sat at the front of the room, her tablet resting on the table. Her notes were meticulous, detailing her progress on SCP-51A's translation and the potential link to the anomalous events. Yet her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the slides, the whispers echoing faintly in her mind, even now. With no context, SCP-51A's translation and the words that followed. "Focus," she muttered to herself. The presentation was crucial. If she could convince the others of her findings, perhaps they could make sense of what was happening. And stop it. The presentation begins. The room quieted as Site Director Nolan took the podium. "Thank you all for assembling on such short notice," he began, his voice firm but edged with weariness. "As you're aware, the containment instability has escalated. Dr. Kaede has been working closely with SCP-51 and SCP-51A. She believes she has uncovered critical information regarding the source of the anomalies." He gestured to Miriam. "Dr. Kaede, you have the floor." Miriam stood, smoothing her lab coat and adjusting her glasses. Her heart raced as she approached the podium, but the whispers in her mind urged her forward. "This is our only chance," they seemed to say. "They need to hear the truth." She cleared her throat and began. As many of you know, SCP-51A is a fragmentary text, an incantation designed to bind malevolent forces. My translation efforts have revealed that the prayer is incomplete. But what I've uncovered so far points to a connection between the incantation and the anomalies we've observed since the pulse. She tapped the screen of her tablet, projecting the deciphered text onto the monitor behind her. The room grew tense as the words appeared, ancient Japanese characters paired with her English translation. "This is a language that no speech therapist has the tools to understand, but might be useful. Into this vessel," she read aloud, "let the unclean spirits dwell." The trigger. The air in the room seemed to shift. a faint vibration humming through the floor. Several researchers exchanged uneasy glances, but Miriam pressed on, oblivious. "Through sacrifice," she continued. "The curse is broken, and by this binding—" A loud crack interrupted her, the sound reverberating through the walls. Miriam froze mid-sentence, her eyes darting to the ceiling as the lights flickered. "What the hell was that?" Victor Harlow muttered, his voice tinged with alarm. But Miriam couldn't stop. The whispers urged her on, drowning out her colleagues' voices. She didn't even realize she was speaking the next line, until it was too late. "The child is protected." The moment the words left her lips, the room was plunged into chaos. The pulse, a deafening, otherworldly hum erupted from the facility, shaking the building to its foundations. The overhead lights burst in a cascade of sparks, plunging the briefing room into near darkness. Monitors blinked and distorted, displaying incomprehensible patterns before going black. "What's happening?" someone shouted, their voice barely audible over the growing roar. Miriam stumbled back from the podium, clutching her head as the whispers surged in intensity, overlapping and incomprehensible. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the room itself was collapsing inward. And then the pulse hit. An invisible wave of energy radiated outward from the room, rippling through the facility like a shock wave. The walls groaned under the pressure, and alarms blared to life throughout the site. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of shattering glass and panicked screams echoed through the halls. A cascading effect. The pulse didn't stop at the briefing room. It spread to every corner of the facility, triggering disturbances across multiple containment wings. In Containment Wing Delta, SCP-173 broke free from its restraints. Guards monitoring the cell were paralyzed by its rapid, erratic movements, several falling victim before containment protocols could even be attempted. In Sector Gamma, SCP-96 began emitting a low, mournful wail. Surveillance equipment near its chamber malfunctioned, and researchers who inadvertently glimpsed its face on distorted monitors were overcome with terror. SCP-682, the indestructible reptile, roared with fury in its containment chamber, slamming against the reinforced walls with unprecedented force. Cracks began to spiderweb across the glass, and containment teams scrambled to reinforce the barriers. Even safe-class anomalies were affected. SCP-2094, the anomalous coffee machine, began dispensing viscous, blood-like fluid instead of its requested beverages. Inanimate SCPs emitted bursts of energy or displayed behaviors that defied their established properties. The aftermath in the briefing room. Back in the briefing room, the pulse subsided, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The air was thick with tension, the hum of residual energy lingering like a storm on the horizon. Miriam collapsed to her knees, her head pounding. The whispers were gone, replaced by a single, deafening voice that echoed in her mind. "Protect the vessel. Complete the prayer." "What have you done?" Nolan demanded, his face pale with fury. He grabbed Miriam by the shoulders, shaking her. "What did you say?" "I didn't mean to," Miriam stammered, her voice weak. Her eyes darted to the projected text, still glowing faintly on the shattered monitor. It just happened." Victor knelt beside her, his expression a mix of fear and concern. "Miriam, that wasn't just a pulse. You've amplified it. It's affecting everything." Victor reached out and pressed a finger against her cheek. The intercom crackled to life, the voice of the head of security barely audible over the sound of chaos. "Director Nolan, we've got breaches in multiple sectors. Kaede-class anomalies are reacting. We can't contain this." Nolan's face darkened. "Seal the facility," he barked. "No one in or out." A growing realization. As the room emptied and personnel rushed to respond to the breaches, Miriam sat motionless, her mind spinning. The weight of what she'd done pressed down on her like a crushing tide. The incantation had triggered the pulse. But why? And why had the whispers demanded she complete the prayer? For the first time, she wondered if the prayer wasn't just about containment, but about unleashing something far worse. The two men descended the staircase at the same time, and in the back of her mind, the whispers returned, quiet yet insistent. Finish it, protect the vessel, set things right. Chapter 8. Containment Collapse. The facility's alarms screamed like banshees, their shrill wails reverberating through the trembling walls. Red emergency lights flickered in the corridors, painting everything in an ominous hue. Chaos reigned as Foundation personnel rushed to respond to the escalating crisis. But it was already too late. Containment had failed, and the consequences were spiraling out of control. Rushing in was the memory of the beating heart that Dr. Miriam Kaede stumbled through the hallways, the cacophony of panicked voices and blaring alarms blending into a single, overwhelming roar. She clutched her tablet to her chest, her knuckles white. The whispers in her mind had grown louder, their cadence matching the relentless pounding of her heartbeat. Protect the vessel. Finish the prayer. The breaches spread. From the control room, Site Director Nolan stood at the center of the maelstrom, barking orders into his radio. Contain SCP-173 immediately. I want containment teams on SCP-682 and SCP-96, double the standard personnel, and someone get me a status report on SCP-718 now. The technicians were frantic, their monitors flickering as they tried to assess the extent of the breaches. On one screen, SCP-173 darted through a hallway at impossible speeds, the broken bodies of guards littering the floor in its wake. On another, SCP-96 was curled in the corner of its containment cell, its wailing escalating into unearthly shrieks that rattled the cameras. Director, we've lost visual on SCP-6882, a panicked technician reported. Its chamber's being breached. What about the perimeter locks? Nolan demanded. They're failing across multiple sectors. Something is interfering with the electronic systems. The technician's words were cut off as the power momentarily flickered, plunging the room into darkness before the backup generators kicked in. End quote. Healing after workouts. Only seal the facility, Nolan ordered, his voice hoarse from shouting. No one gets in or out. Full lockdown. Throughout the site, steel blast doors slid into place with a resounding clang, sealing the facility's personnel inside with the anomalies. The air seemed to grow heavier, the atmosphere charged with an electric tension that made every breath feel like a struggle. Miriam, still wandering the labyrinthine corridors, froze as one of the blast doors slammed shut in front of her, narrowly missing her by inches. Her reflection stared back at her in the polished steel, her face pale and drawn. "Trapped," she whispered. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. There was no way out. The chaos within. As Miriam made her way through the facility, the signs of the breaches became more apparent and more horrifying. In Sector Delta, SCP-173's trail of destruction was marked by twisted bodies and blood-streaked walls. Miriam heard the sound of breaking glass and frantic shouts echoing from around the corner. She ducked into a side room, trembling as the screams abruptly stopped. In Sector Gamma, SCP-718, the anomalous camera scuttled along the ceiling like a mechanical spider. Miriam caught a glimpse of it through a glass panel. Its lens swiveled toward her, and for a terrifying moment she thought it would come through the door. Instead, it crawled away, leaving behind a team of unconscious guards sprawled in its wake. In Containment Wing Epsilon, SCP-96's cries reverberated through the walls, sending shivers down Miriam's spine. She covered her ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate her very bones. She passed a shattered observation room, its monitors sparking, and prayed she wouldn't accidentally glimpse the creature's face. A descent into terror. Miriam found temporary refuge in an abandoned storage room, the flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows. She slumped against a wall, trying to catch her breath, but the whispers wouldn't let her rest. The path exclaimed, "Protect the vessel, complete the prayer." "What do you want from me?" she hissed, clutching her head. Her voice echoed in the empty room, but the whispers didn't respond. Instead, a chilling silence filled the space, broken only by the distant sounds of chaos. The silence was worse. An unexpected encounter. Suddenly, the door to the storage room creaked open. Miriam scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering. A shadow loomed in the doorway, and for a moment, she thought it was another breach.
Miriam!
"I don't know what's happening," Miriam stammered. "It's all falling apart." Victor nodded grimly. "The pulse from your presentation. It triggered something. Every SCP in this facility is reacting, even the ones that have been dormant for years." "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice trembling. "I was trying to—" "Save it," Victor interrupted. "Right now, we need to survive. The lockdown sealed us in here with those things. If we don't figure something out, we're all dead." The facility's transformation. As they moved through the corridors together, it became clear that the facility itself was changing. The anomaly's influence seemed to warp reality. The cabinet door changed its position. Hallways stretched endlessly, looping back on themselves in impossible configurations. Doors that once led to storage rooms now opened into empty voids or entirely different sectors. The air grew colder, the lights dimmer, as if the facility was sinking into some unseen abyss. As Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that SCP-51 was at the center of it all. The whispers had grown quieter, more focused, but their message was clear. Find the vessel, finish the prayer. A grim decision. Victor stopped abruptly, pulling Miriam into an alcove. "Look," he said, pointing down the hallway. At the far end, SCP-173 stood motionless, its lifeless gaze fixed on the corridor. A group of researchers had been cornered, their terrified faces lit by the flickering emergency lights. One by one, they blinked, and SCP-173 struck. Miriam turned away, bile rising in her throat. "We can't stop this," she whispered. "Silly dear." "Maybe not," Victor replied, his voice grim. "But if you think SCP-51 has anything to do with this, we need to find it. Now." Miriam hesitated, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. But she knew he was right. The chaos was spreading, and SCP-51 was the key, whether to their salvation or their doom. "Let's go," she said, steeling herself. Together they disappeared into the darkened halls, the sounds of the breaches growing louder around them. The facility was falling apart, and time was running out. Chapter 9. SCP-51's Awakening. The labyrinthine corridors of the facility seemed endless, their sterile walls now marred by bloodstains, flickering lights, and the occasional ominous shadow. Miriam and Victor moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the near silence. The further they ventured toward SCP-51's containment chamber, the heavier the air grew. She lost track of everyone else's steps as she made her way along. Miriam clutched her tablet, though its purpose now seemed irrelevant. The whispers that had plagued her for days were no longer faint suggestions. They were clear, commanding, and insistent. Protect the vessel. Protect the child. The whispers amplify. As they approached the containment wing housing SCP-051, Miriam stumbled, clutching her head. A piercing wave of sound filled her mind, a cacophony of overlapping voices that resolved into a single, chilling phrase. "Save the child, Miriam." Victor caught her arm, steadying her. "Miriam, are you okay?" She nodded shakily, though the truth was far from it. Her vision blurred, and for a brief moment, the hallway around her seemed to ripple, as if reality itself were fraying. She blinked, and the distortion faded, leaving only the suffocating weight of the whispers. "We're close," she muttered. "I can feel it." Victor gave her a skeptical look, but didn't argue. They pressed on, the air growing colder with every step. The hallucinations begin. As they neared SCP-051's containment chamber, Miriam's surroundings began to shift. At first, it was subtle, the faint sound of an infant crying, distant but unmistakable. She froze mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Victor frowned. "Hear what?" she insisted, her voice trembling. "A baby." Pam let her words trail away. Victor shook his head. "I didn't hear anything." The crying grew louder, echoing through the hallway. Miriam's pulse quickened as she glanced around, searching for the source. Her eyes landed on a shadowy figure at the far end of the corridor, a hunched shape, cradling something in its arms. The figure turned, and for an instant, Miriam swore she saw the deformed face of an infant staring back at her. She blinked, and the vision was gone. "Miriam, what's wrong?" Victor asked, his tone urgent. "Nothing," she lied, her voice hollow. "Let's keep going." SCP-051's chamber. When they reached the containment chamber, the door was ajar, its locking mechanisms twisted and broken. Victor hesitated, but Miriam pushed forward, drawn by an unseen force. The room beyond was bathed in an eerie, flickering light. SCP-051 sat on its pedestal, its ivory surface glowing faintly. The doll's hollow eyes seemed to follow Miriam as she stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. The whispers intensified, filling the chamber with an oppressive presence. Miriam fell to her knees, clutching her head as the voices overlapped, their urgency unbearable. "Protect the child. Save the vessel." Victor stayed near the entrance, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon. "Miriam, get back! That thing isn't safe!" But she couldn't hear him. Her vision swam as the room dissolved around her, replaced by a nightmarish scene. The hallucination. Miriam found herself standing in a shadowy chamber, its walls lined with ancient carvings. At the center of the room was SCP-051, its glow brighter now, illuminating the grotesque figure lying at its feet, a deformed infant, its tiny body twisted and wrong. Its skin was translucent, its veins pulsing with an unnatural light. The creature writhed, its hollow, milk-white eyes locking onto Miriam. "Help me," it pleaded, its voice a distorted echo. Miriam recoiled, her stomach churning. "What are you?" "I am bound," the infant said, its tone filled with anguish. "They trapped me here, to protect others." "The prayer," Miriam whispered. "It was meant to bind you." The infant nodded weakly. "But the binding is incomplete. I cannot rest. I cannot leave. You must finish it." Before Miriam could respond, the vision shifted. The walls of the chamber cracked and crumbled, revealing the shadowy figures from her dreams. They encircled her, their chanting rising to a deafening crescendo. The infant screamed, its voice merging with the whispers in Miriam's mind. "Finish it. Protect the child." Back to reality. Miriam jolted back to consciousness, gasping for air. She was still in SCP-51's containment chamber, but the vision's impact lingered. The doll's glow had dimmed, yet its presence felt heavier, almost suffocating. Victor rushed to her side. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I saw it," Miriam murmured, her voice distant. "The child? It's trapped." The prayer wasn't just about binding. It was about transferring the curse. "Sacrifice to save the others," said Oriana. Miriam translated solemnly. Excavation bodyguards were hired to man the prisoners. A small circle of civilians quickly surrounded the group. Victor frowned, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. "Miriam, this thing is messing with your head. We need to leave before it gets worse." But Miriam shook her head, her resolve hardening. "No. I have to finish what I started. If I don't, this won't stop. The breaches, the chaos, it's all connected to SCP-51. Victor hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But if you start hearing anything else, you tell me." "Got it?" Miriam didn't answer. Her gaze was locked on the doll, its hollow eyes staring back at her. The whispers had quieted, but their message was clear. They forever wish. Protect the vessel, save the child. And Miriam knew she didn't have a choice. Chapter 10. The Unnatural Pregnancy. The silence of Miriam's quarters was suffocating. The emergency alarms from the containment breach had finally ceased, but the tension in the air remained, a palpable reminder of the chaos spreading throughout the facility. Miriam sat on the edge of her bed, her head in her hands. Her body felt foreign, heavy in a way she couldn't explain. Her thoughts drifted back to the hallucination in SCP-51's chamber, the deformed infant pleading for her help, its hollow eyes burned into her memory. She shuddered, trying to shake the image, but it clung to her like a shadow. The first signs. The symptoms began that night. It started as a faint pressure in her abdomen, a dull ache that she initially dismissed as stress. But as the hours passed, the sensation grew sharper, more insistent. By morning, Miriam awoke, drenched in sweat, her stomach tight, with a pain that made her double over. She staggered to the bathroom, her breath shallow. Pulling up her shirt, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her stomach, normally flat, had a slight but noticeable swell. A cold dread settled over her as she touched the area, feeling an unnatural warmth beneath her skin. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. This isn't possible." The whispers in her mind returned, their tones soothing yet ominous. "Protect the vessel. Save the child." The medical scam. Unable to ignore the growing unease, Miriam made her way to the facility's medical bay. The chaos of the breaches had left the area deserted, the usual bustle of staff replaced by eerie silence. She hesitated before stepping inside, her heart pounding. Using the facility's diagnostic equipment, Miriam conducted a full-body scan. The results appeared on the monitor moments later, and her breath caught in her throat. The scan showed a fetus, tiny but unmistakably there, nestled within her womb. It pulsed faintly, its veins glowing with a dim, otherworldly light. Miriam's hands trembled as she reached for the controls, magnifying the image. "Oh, it's impossible," she whispered. "I haven't." Her mind raced, searching for explanations. There was no possibility of conception, no partner, no procedure, nothing. And yet, the evidence was irrefutable. As she stared at the monitor, the whispers returned, louder this time, almost jubilant. "Surgical tape. Protect the child. Complete the prayer." Sarah. Anomalous behavior. Over the next few hours, the symptoms intensified. The fetus was growing at an alarming rate. the swelling of her abdomen now visible even beneath her clothing. The glowing veins beneath her skin seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, their light faintly visible in dim rooms. Worse, the whispers weren't just in her mind anymore. She began hearing them in the room around her, disembodied voices echoing softly from the walls. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder as the day went on. Victor found her in the medical bay, hunched over the monitor with dark circles under her eyes. He froze when he saw her. "Miriam, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice filled with alarm. She turned to him, her face pale and drawn. It's inside me," she said, her voice trembling. "The child from the vision. It's real." Victor stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and horror. "That's not possible. You need to get to—" "Don't you think I've tried?" Miriam interrupted, her voice rising. "I ran the scans. Look at the results." She gestured to the monitor, where the glowing image of the fetus was still displayed. Victor stepped closer, his eyes widening as he took in the sight. That's not human," he muttered. "I know," Miriam said, her voice barely above a whisper. She clutched her stomach, the faint, pulsing warmth radiating through her palms. "It's SCP-051. It's connected to it somehow. The prayer, the breaches, it's all tied to this thing." Escalating phenomena. As they spoke, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with an unsettling harmony. Victor stiffened, his eyes darting around. "You hear that, don't you?" he asked. Miriam nodded, her expression grim. "You're not supposed to hear them. It was just me before." The whispers seemed to respond, their tone rising in urgency. "Rid the vessel. Save the child." Victor backed away, his face pale. "This isn't natural, Miriam. We need to get you out of here. Find a way to—" "We can't leave," she interrupted, shaking her head. "The lockdown's still in place, and even if we could, I don't think it would matter. This, whatever it is, it's not going to let me go." Victor ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "Then what do we do?" Miriam stared at the glowing veins beneath her skin, the whispers swirling around her like a storm. The answer was as terrifying as it was inevitable. The laureate whimpered. "We finished the prayer," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "It's the only way to stop this." Victor hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You really believe that?" "We have to go if we have to make critical decisions," Miriam replied. "If we don't, this thing will destroy me and the entire facility. The burden of choice. The burden of choice. There's a book." The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. Victor glanced at the monitor again, the unnatural fetus pulsating faintly. He knew she was right, but the thought of what completing the prayer might entail filled him with dread. "Then we'd better get moving," he said finally, his voice grim. "If this thing is tied to SCP-051, we'll need to go back to its chamber, and fast." Miriam nodded, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. The whispers quieted slightly, their urgency replaced with a strange sense of anticipation. As they left the medical bay, the flickering lights cast long shadows in the hallway. The facility felt even more oppressive now, the breaches escalating with every passing moment. Striding through with presence of mind, he set to work dismantling his fallen chairman. But Miriam no longer felt fear. The life growing inside her was no longer just an anomaly. It was a purpose, a burden she couldn't escape. And as the whispers echoed around her, she realized the truth. The child wasn't just a part of her. It was the key to everything. Chapter 11. The whispering spreads. The containment facility had grown eerily quiet in the hour since Miriam's shocking discovery in the medical bay. The usual background hum of machinery and muffled voices was replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional flicker of lights or the distant echo of a scream. But for those who remained in the facility, the silence wasn't comforting, it was oppressive. The whispers were spreading. The first cases. It began subtly. Guards stationed near SCP-51's containment chamber started reporting faint voices, barely audible, like wind rustling through leaves. At first, they dismissed it as stress or fatigue, but the whispers persisted, growing louder the longer they stood watch. One guard, Private Lutz, was the first to break. "They're everywhere," he muttered, pacing the hallway outside the chamber. "I can hear them. They're telling me to—" "What?" his partner asked. Uneasy. Lutz's face twisted into a grimace. He clutched his head, his fingers digging into his scalp. "It doesn't matter," he hissed. "We're all damned anyway." Before his partner could intervene, Lutz drew his sidearm and turned it on himself. The gunshot echoed through the hallway, drawing staff from nearby sectors. By the time Miriam and Victor arrived, Lutz's lifeless body lay in a pool of blood, his wide-open eyes filled with terror. Escalation among the staff. End of Section 100. News of the incident spread quickly, fueling panic among the remaining personnel. But the whispers weren't limited to those near SCP-51 anymore. They began creeping through the facility, slipping into the ears of staff like an insidious parasite. Researchers and guards alike reported hearing faint voices, some claiming they came from the ventilation system, others insisting they were inside their own heads. At first, the voices were incomprehensible murmurs, but over time the words became clearer. Cleanse the unborn, protect the vessel, prepare for the reckoning. One researcher, Dr. Elise Wren, locked herself in her office after a series of increasingly erratic episodes. When her colleagues forced the door open, they found her crouched in the corner, rocking back and forth. Her arms were covered in shallow cuts, arranged in jagged lines and circles. "They're coming," she whispered, her eyes wide and unseeing. "The reckoning is coming. We have to stop it. We have to." She lunged at her colleagues with a scalpel, screaming incoherently, before being subdued and sedated. Mass hysteria. The whispers weren't just driving individuals to self-destruction. They were sowing chaos among the staff. Paranoia spread like wildfire, fueled by the voices and the unrelenting tension of the breaches. Some staff members turned on each other, accusing their colleagues of being vessels or agents of the reckoning. In one incident, 2 guards in Sector Epsilon began arguing after one claimed to hear SCP-51 speaking directly to him. The argument escalated into a physical altercation, and within moments both guards had drawn their weapons. By the time a response team arrived, one was dead and the other was critically injured. The doll's growing influence. Miriam and Victor moved cautiously through the facility, avoiding areas where the disturbances were worst. The whispers were louder now, no longer confined to SCP-51's chamber. Miriam could hear them even in the most distant sectors, their words a constant, oppressive presence in her mind. "They're losing control," Victor muttered, glancing at a blood-stained hallway as they passed. "The staff is turning on each other. If this keeps up, there won't be anyone left to contain the breaches." "It's the doll," Miriam said, her voice strained. "It's amplifying its influence. The pulse I triggered, it woke something up." Victor stopped, his expression dark. "And you think it's connected to the thing inside you?" Miriam hesitated, her hand resting instinctively on her swollen abdomen. The whispers seemed to respond, their tone shifting to one of urgency. "Directed the vessel. Cleanse the unworthy. I don't know, she admitted finally, but I can feel it growing stronger. Whatever it is, it's tied to SCP-051. And if we don't finish the prayer... She didn't need to finish the sentence. The consequences were clear. The reckoning. As they neared the control center, the whispers reached a fever pitch. Staff members roamed the hallways like zombies, their faces pale and drawn. Some muttered to themselves, their words an unsettling mix of prayers and gibberish. Others were eerily silent, their eyes glazed over as they wandered aimlessly, their eyes wide. One technician, seated at a console, turned to them as they entered. His face was streaked with tears, and his hands trembled as he pointed toward SCP-051's containment chamber on the monitor. "She's speaking," he said, his voice quivering. "The doll. She's telling us what we have to do. We have to stop it, cleanse the unborn, or the reckoning will consume us all." Victor grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him. "Snap out of it. The doll isn't telling you anything. It's manipulating you." The technician shook his head, his eyes filled with despair. "You don't understand. We can't stop it. It's already begun. Nothing can stop this but you." Before Victor could stop him, the technician grabbed a shard of broken glass from the console and slit his throat, collapsing in a heap on the floor. Miriam turned away, her stomach twisting with nausea. The whispers surged, louder and more insistent, drowning out even the alarms. Finish the prayer, save the child. A dire choice. Victor pulled Miriam aside, his face pale but determined. "This is out of control. If SCP-051's influence keeps spreading, the entire facility will tear itself apart. We have to stop it." Miriam met his gaze, her expression filled with uncertainty. "You think I don't know that? But I don't even know if completing the prayer will stop it or make it worse." Victor placed a hand on her shoulder. "Right now, it's our only chance. If this thing inside you is tied to SCP-051, then you're the key to fixing this." A moment later, he did the same thing. Inspector Karim returned. Miriam swallowed hard, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. The whispers seemed to agree, their tones softening, as if coaxing her forward. "Protect the vessel, complete the prayer." Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "Let's end this." Together, they turned toward SCP-051's containment chamber, the whispers guiding their every step. Chapter 12. Paranormal Epidemic. The containment facility was falling apart, not just physically, but in ways that defied logic and reason. The anomalies unleashed by the pulse weren't confined to breached SCPs anymore. They had seeped into the very structure of the facility, warping it into a surreal nightmare. The air was thick with tension. The oppressive whispers of SCP-051 now a constant backdrop to the chaos. Every step Miriam and Victor took felt like moving through molasses, the atmosphere heavy and electric, as though the fabric of reality itself was unraveling. Pregnant staff in peril. Among the most horrifying consequences of the escalating crisis were the sudden, inexplicable miscarriages. Reports trickled in of female staff members collapsing without warning, clutching their stomachs in agony. Those in early stages of pregnancy, some unaware they were even pregnant, experienced rapid bleeding and unbearable cramps. Medical teams scrambled to assist, but nothing could stop the inevitable losses. Dr. Karen Ellison, a senior researcher in her second trimester, had been one of the first affected. Miriam and Victor stumbled across her, collapsed in a hallway, her lab coat stained with blood. She clutched at Miriam's arm, her voice weak and broken. "I didn't even know," Karen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I felt something. Take it." Miriam knelt beside her, overwhelmed by guilt and horror. She could feel the whispers in the air around them, soft and mocking. Cleanse the unborn. Karen's breathing slowed as the light faded from her eyes. Miriam could do nothing but close them, her hands shaking. Victor placed a hand on her shoulder. We have to keep moving. We can't help them. Miriam nodded, her stomach twisting with nausea. She glanced down at her own abdomen, where the unnatural fetus inside her pulsed faintly. She knew it wasn't just growing, it was feeding. The facility's distortion. As the epidemic spread, the facility itself began to change in impossible ways. Shifting walls, hallways that Miriam and Victor had traversed moments earlier now led to entirely different sectors. Doors appeared and disappeared, and rooms that once existed were replaced with featureless voids. In some cases, walls shifted in real time, trapping unfortunate staff members in spaces that blinked out of existence. Time loops. Several teams reported being caught in repeating cycles of events. One guard claimed he had walked the same hallway a dozen times, only to find himself back where he started, no matter which direction he turned. In one horrifying instance, a researcher stumbled into Miriam and Victor repeatedly, each time more disheveled and panicked, before vanishing entirely. Temporal phenomena. Clocks no longer kept accurate time. In one observation room, a monitor displayed a feed from SCP-173's containment chamber, but the footage showed events that had occurred hours earlier. In another sector, personnel claimed to see their own reflections moving independently in reflective surfaces. Manifestations of the whisper. The whispers, once confined to Miriam's mind, now filled the air like a malevolent chorus. They resonated through the walls, vibrating the very structure of the facility. Staff members who listened too long began to hear personal messages, each more insidious than the last. Why did you let them die? You're next. Cleanse the vessel. Save yourself. One guard succumbed to the voices, clawing at his ears in a futile attempt to block them out. "They're inside me!" he screamed before smashing his head against the wall repeatedly until he collapsed. To Miriam, the whispers were more coherent, more focused. They called her name, imploring her to finish the prayer and fulfill her purpose. She felt their pull with every step, an invisible thread tightening around her. Beeping. A Haunting Encounter. Written by Stephen King. Read reading procured. As Miriam and Victor pressed forward, they entered a hallway bathed in a sickly green light. The walls seemed to ripple like liquid, and a low hum vibrated the air. Captain Victor reached the door. "Oh, what is this?" Victor whispered, gripping his weapon tightly. "I don't know," Miriam replied, her voice shaking. Suddenly, the lights flickered and shadowy figures appeared at the edges of their vision. They were humanoid, but indistinct, their forms shifting like smoke. They didn't move, didn't attack, just stared, with hollow, featureless faces. Miriam froze, her heart pounding. "Do you see them?" she asked Victor. He nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Yeah, and I don't think they're friendly." The whispers grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. The figures began to multiply, their forms crowding the hallway until there was no escape. Miriam felt the pressure in her head increase, a sharp, stabbing pain that made her stumble. When the pain was moderated, the figures withdrew and the hollow became only empty. Protect the vessel, finish the prayer. As suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished, leaving only an eerie silence in their wake. Victor exhaled sharply. "We need to get to SCP-51. Now." The inspector's eyes lingered on the words his godson was writing. Blurring connection. Miriam couldn't deny the connection between the patients of the school and the chaos unfolding around them. The doll's influence had spread far beyond its containment chamber, infecting the facility like a virus. The child inside her, if it could even be called that, was somehow at the center of it all. I think the prayer was never meant to be completed," Miriam said, as they continued through the distorted halls. "It wasn't just a binding spell. It was a trap, a way to contain something." Miriam pulled Duncan. The victor looked at her, his expression grim. "And now it's using you to escape." Miriam nodded, her hand instinctively resting on her abdomen. The whispers seemed to respond, their tone shifting to one of urgency and anger. "Finish the prayer, protect the vessel." The descent into madness. As they approached SCP-51's containment chamber, the distortions worsened. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the air was thick with a suffocating pressure. Miriam could feel the child inside her stirring, its movements synchronized with the whispers. Victor pulled her aside, his voice low but firm. "If completing the prayer is what it wants, maybe we shouldn't do it." Miriam hesitated, her mind racing. The whispers filled her head, drowning out her own thoughts. "Don't know," she admitted, "but if we don't, I think it'll destroy everything." "Oh." Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then let's end this." Together, they stepped into SCP-51's chamber, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. Reality itself seemed to twist around them as they faced the doll, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. The reckoning had begun. Chapter 13. The Paradox Connection. The chamber housing SCP-51 felt like the eye of a storm, a place of unsettling calm amid the chaos consuming the facility. The doll sat on its pedestal, unmoving, its ivory surface glowing faintly in the flickering emergency lights. Miriam stood at the threshold, the whispers hammering at her mind with relentless force. Victor lingered behind her, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "Or whatever's happening, it all leads back to that thing." Miriam didn't respond. Her attention was focused inward. The whispers, once a maddening cacophony, had begun to merge into a single voice, low and resonant. It spoke directly to her now, bypassing the air entirely and resonating in her skull. After workouts her breath caught in her throat. The voice was different, distinct from the malevolent tone of the whispers. It was softer, almost pleading. It wasn't the doll, it was the child. The first telepathic connection. The glow beneath her skin intensified, the veins on her abdomen pulsing faintly in the dim light. Miriam clutched her stomach, sinking to her knees as the voice grew stronger. Upon hearing the voice, the woman bowed low. "Mother," it said again, more insistent this time. "You must listen." Victor rushed to her side. "Miriam, what's happening? Are you okay?" She waved him off, her breathing shallow. It's the child," she said, her voice trembling. "It's talking to me." Victor froze, his expression unreadable. "Talking? Like telepathically?" Andy didn't react. Miriam nodded, her hands pressing against her stomach. The voice filled her mind, drowning out everything else. "The prayer," the child said. "It is incomplete. It always has been." "What do you mean?" Miriam whispered aloud, though the connection seemed to bypass spoken words entirely. "The text on SCP-51A. It's damaged." "How do you know?" "I know because I am bound by it," the child replied. "The fragments that remain are not enough. Without the full incantation, the binding is flawed. The vessel is flawed." Miriam's head spun as the implication sank in. "You mean the anomalies, the breaches, they're all because the binding is incomplete? Yes, the child said, its tone heavy with sadness. The containment was never meant to last. It was only a delay, a stopgap. And now it is unraveling. The terrible cost. Victor stared at Miriam, his concern deepening as she muttered to herself. "What is it saying?" he asked. It's explaining," Miriam said, her voice distant. The prayer, the incantation, was supposed to be permanent, but it wasn't completed. That's why the anomalies are spreading. The vessel, SCP-051, can't hold them anymore. Victor frowned. Miriam hesitated, her stomach twisting. The child's voice grew louder in her mind. "The full incantation will neutralize the anomalies," it said. "It will seal the vessel and stabilize the breach." "But there's a catch, isn't there?" Miriam whispered. She already knew the answer. "Yes," the child admitted. "To complete the prayer, a sacrifice must be made. The life that sustains the vessel must be given freely." "I pray that you succeed," the screen angel said. "And we can clear the place." Miriam's blood ran cold. "You mean you?" "Yes," the child said simply. "My existence is the anchor. Without me, the anomalies cannot be contained. The vessel cannot hold them."
Oh.
Tears welled in Miriam's eyes. Despite everything, the impossible circumstances, the terror surrounding her, she couldn't deny the connection she felt to the child growing inside her. It was part of her, no matter how unnatural its creation. 10 minutes later, Polk abandoned his Nephitema and returned to the minivan. Victor's realization. Victor knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Miriam, talk to me. What's it saying?" She wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. "It's saying that to finish the prayer, the vessel needs a sacrifice. The child, it has to die." Victor's face hardened. "And what happens if we don't?" "The breaches will get worse," Miriam said. "The facility, the world, it won't survive." Victor cursed under his breath, pacing the room. "That's not a choice," he muttered. That's blackmail." "It's the only way," Miriam said softly. "And it knows it." A mother's dilemma. The child's voice returned, gentler now. "I do not wish to harm you, Mother, but this is what I was created for. My purpose is to protect." Miriam's hands trembled as she pressed them against her stomach. "You're not just a tool," she said, her voice breaking. "You're alive. You're my child." "I know," the child replied, "and I am sorry." The whispers around her grew louder, as if urging her to act. The doll on its pedestal seemed to glow brighter, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Victor stopped pacing, his face grim. "So, what do we do?" Miriam looked up at him, her tears glistening in the flickering light. "We finished the prayer," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "But I'm not ready. I need time." Victor nodded, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. "We'll find a way to buy it," he said. "But Miriam, you need to decide. Quickly." Hunter nodded to Wilson. A mother's resolve? As the two of them prepared to leave the chamber, the child spoke again, its voice soft but resolute. "Mother," it said, "when the time comes, you must let me go. It is the only way." Miriam closed her eyes, the tears streaming freely now. "I'll do what I have to," she whispered, "but not yet." The glow beneath her skin dimmed, the connection fading as the child retreated into silence. The room felt colder, emptier, without its presence. Victor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this," he said. "Somehow." Miriam nodded, but her resolve was already forming. The cost was unbearable, but the alternative was unthinkable. She had a duty, to the child, to the world, and she would see it through, even if it broke her. Chapter 14. A Fragmented Reality. The facility's oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on Miriam as she and Victor navigated the labyrinthine halls. The air felt thick, as though reality itself were straining under the pressure of the anomalies. The whispers, once a constant hum in the back of Miriam's mind, now surged unpredictably, their voices fragmented and jarring. Her back-issued pristine teeth had been created by the actual cutouts over the past decade. As she pressed forward, the world around her began to blur, her vision swimming as though she were peering through rippling water. She blinked, trying to steady herself, but the sensation only grew stronger. "Sergei Haruslavsky." "Miriam," Victor said, his voice distant and distorted. "Are you okay?" She barely registered his words. The hallway in front of her had shifted. Gone were the sterile white walls of the facility. In their place stood weathered wooden beams and paper screens illuminated by the warm glow of lanterns. The scent of aged wood and incense filled the air. She wasn't in the facility anymore. Visions of ancient Japan. Miriam stood in a dimly lit chamber, its walls adorned with intricate carvings of strange symbols and fierce Oni-like figures. A soft chanting filled the air, low and rhythmic, spoken in an ancient Japanese dialect that Miriam barely recognized but somehow understood. In the center of the room, a figure knelt before a carved ivory doll, SCP-051. The figure was a woman, her hair elaborately styled, her robes flowing like water. Her face was shadowed, but her presence was commanding, exuding a palpable aura of desperation and determination. The woman held SCP-051 in her hands, muttering incantations under her breath. As she spoke, the room seemed to darken, shadows stretching across the walls. Miriam's gaze was drawn to the doll's hollow eyes, which now glowed faintly, as though absorbing the power around it. The binding ritual. The chanting grew louder, and Miriam's vision shifted. She was no longer standing in the room but watching from a vantage point just above the woman. She could feel the weight of the ritual, the urgency behind every word. The woman's voice cracked as she spoke, her tone laced with fear. As the final words of the incantation echoed through the chamber, a violent wind tore through the room, extinguishing the lanterns. Shadows surged toward SCP-051, writhing and shrieking as they were drawn into the doll's hollow core. The air was filled with an unearthly cacophony, screams of rage and anguish, as though the spirits themselves resisted their imprisonment. Miriam felt the power of the binding, the raw, terrifying energy that threatened to consume the woman. She saw the toll it took. The woman's hands trembled, her face twisted in pain. Yet the ritual succeeded. The spirits were sealed, their cries fading into silence. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, foreboding, as though the spirits were merely waiting. The consequences of failure. The vision shifted again, and Miriam found herself standing in the aftermath of the ritual. The woman knelt on the floor, her body frail and broken. SCP-051 rested on its pedestal, its presence oppressive, even in stillness. Her workouts were distorted by the peace didn't last. Time blurred as the scene dissolved and reformed. Miriam now stood in a village at dusk. The same woman was there, her once commanding presence now replaced with exhaustion and despair. She held SCP-51 in her arms, but its glow had dimmed, its power waning. The spirits, once sealed, began to seep out. Miriam saw the effects firsthand, villagers collapsing in agony, their bodies twisting unnaturally as shadowy tendrils enveloped them. Women clutched their swollen bellies, screaming as their pregnancies ended in blood and horror. Children cried out as unseen forces tore through the village, leaving only ruin in their wake. The woman screamed, clutching SCP-51 tighter. "No! Stay bound! Stay sealed!" But her pleas were in vain. The vessel had failed. Miriam's heart raced as she witnessed the devastation. She understood now. The binding wasn't just a spell. It was a fragile balance, one that required constant vigilance. And when that balance was broken, the spirits returned with unrelenting fury. A warning from the past. The vision shifted once more. Miriam stood back in the chamber with the woman, now aged and frail. Her hands rested on SCP-51, her eyes hollow and filled with regret. Miriam calmly took the new menu and placed it before them. "It was never enough," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "The binding is temporary. It requires sacrifice, life for life. Without it, the spirits will break free." The woman's gaze turned directly to Miriam, her expression haunted. "You must finish it. You must ensure the vessel holds. If you fail, the reckoning will consume everything." "If I fail?" Miriam felt the weight of those words as the vision began to dissolve. The room, the woman, SCP-51, all of it faded into darkness. Reality returns. Miriam gasped, collapsing to her knees as the facility's sterile walls reappeared around her. Victor knelt beside her, his hands on her shoulders. Slowly, "Miriam, talk to me. What just happened?" She looked up at him, her face pale and streaked with tears. I saw her. The woman who created SCP-51. I saw what happens when the binding fails." Victor frowned, his expression tense. "And?" Miriam's voice was barely a whisper. "The spirits. The anomalies. They'll consume everything. The binding isn't enough. It never was. The only way to stop them is to complete the prayer." Victor nodded grimly, helping her to her feet. "Then we'd better make sure we finish it. Fast." As they moved toward SCP-51's chamber, Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's warning had been more than a vision. It was a message, a plea from the past to ensure that history didn't repeat itself. Doubts rose in her mind as to what might have contributed to the death sentence on the woman's forehead. And this time, the stakes were even higher. Chapter 15. The Sacrificial Choice. The chamber holding SCP-51 pulsed with an unnatural energy, the air thick and charged, as if the very fabric of the room was alive. Miriam stood before the doll's pedestal, Victor by her side. The glow emanating from SCP-51's hollow eyes seemed brighter now, more menacing, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the wall. The whispers, once chaotic and fragmented, had coalesced into a singular, commanding voice. "Finish the prayer. Sacrifice the child. End this." Miriam's breath hitched as the weight of those words settled on her. The whispers weren't merely suggestions anymore. They were demands, spoken with an urgency that left no room for doubt. Yet, in the depths of her mind, another voice stirred, softer, weaker, but unmistakable. "Mother," it said, its tone trembling, "please, don't." He had too promised time to spend. List. Maria began to cry.
Yeah,
The doll's command. SCP-51 seemed almost alive now, its presence filling the chamber with an oppressive dread. Miriam stepped closer, drawn toward it despite every instinct screaming for her to stay away. "Sacrifice is the only way," the doll whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "The vessel must hold. The spirits must be contained." Victor stiffened beside her, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "Miriam, you don't have to listen to it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "You don't know what it's trying to do." Miriam barely heard him. Her focus was entirely on the doll, its hollow gaze pulling her deeper into its influence. "You created this," it said, its voice shifting, taking on the tone of the ancient woman from her vision. "The child is the anchor. It was always meant to be. Without the sacrifice, the spirits will be free. The world will burn." The child's plea. The glow in her abdomen intensified, the veins beneath her skin pulsing with light. The voice of the child, the life growing inside her, grew louder, pushing back against the doll's influence. "Don't trust it," the child pleaded. "It lies." Miriam's knees buckled, and she clutched her stomach, overwhelmed by the two opposing forces fighting for control of her mind. "The spirits are bound," the child continued, its voice fragile yet determined. "But the doll was corrupted. It serves not to protect but to consume. If you complete the prayer, it will devour me." Miriam's head swam as she tried to make sense of it all. She sank to the floor, trembling. "You're saying the prayer will destroy you?" "Yes," the child replied, "but it won't stop the spirits. It will only make them stronger." The doll's voice cut through like a blade, harsh and demanding. "It lies. Finish the prayer or all will perish." Victor's intervention. Victor knelt beside Miriam, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Miriam, look at me. Whatever this thing is, whatever it's saying, it's manipulating you. You've seen what it can do." Miriam's eyes filled with tears. But, if I don't finish the prayer, the anomalies, the breaches, they'll destroy everything." Victor said firmly, "it's exactly what the doll wants you to think." The child's voice returned, softer now, almost pleading. "Please, Mother, trust me. Together we can find another way." Time of Fate's face had disappeared into the shadows of the cabin. The weight of the decision. Miriam felt as though she were being torn in two. On one side was SCP-51, its commanding presence undeniable, its whispers demanding obedience. On the other was the faint but persistent voice of the child, a fragile thread of hope against the overwhelming darkness. Her thoughts raced. If the child was telling the truth, completing the prayer would doom them all. But if the doll was right, refusing to finish it would mean the annihilation of everything she held dear. "Miriam," Victor said, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "You don't have to decide alone. We'll figure this out. But if you give in to that thing—" He trailed off, his expression grim. "You might lose more than you think." The doll's true nature. As Miriam struggled with her choice, the doll's whispers grew more insistent, its voice rising in pitch and intensity. "Finish the prayer and sacrifice the vessel. Do it now." But something about its tone struck her as wrong. It was too desperate, too demanding. She remembered the vision of the ancient woman, her warning about the binding's fragility and the devastation that followed. The child's voice returned, clearer than ever. "It doesn't want to stop the spirits. It wants to free them. If you complete the prayer, you'll open the vessel, not seal it." Miriam's breath caught as realization dawned. The doll's whispers weren't commands of protection. They were commands of destruction. Mother's resolve. Miriam rose unsteadily to her feet, her gaze locked on SCP-51. "You've been lying," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "The prayer isn't meant to seal the spirits, it's meant to unleash them." The doll's glow pulsed violently, its whispers turning into an incoherent roar. You don't understand. Finish it. Finish it now." Victor stepped between Miriam and the doll, his weapon drawn. "What do we do, Miriam?" She looked down at her glowing abdomen, the faint pulse of the child's presence giving her strength. "We don't finish the prayer," she said. "We break the cycle. We destroy the doll." The doll's voice screamed in protest, the chamber shaking as its influence lashed out. Shadows writhed along the walls, the air filled with a deafening cacophony. Victor steadied himself, aiming his weapon. "Let's end this." The final choice. As Miriam and Victor prepared to destroy SCP-51, the child spoke one last time, its voice filled with quiet determination. "Thank you, Mother. Whatever happens, I'm with you." Miriam nodded, tears streaming down her face. The weight of her choice was unbearable, but it was hers to make, and she would see it through. Chapter 16. Final Breach. The containment facility was on the brink of collapse. The alarms, which had become an almost comforting constant over the past few hours, now fell silent, replaced by an unnatural stillness that was far worse. The oppressive air seemed to hum with barely contained energy, and the walls trembled as though the building itself were alive, reacting to the chaos within. As clarifying a demonstration, it became obvious something had resisted. Miriam and Victor moved cautiously through the hallways, the whispers growing louder and more insistent with every step. They passed flickering lights and warped corridors, where time and space bent in impossible ways. The facility was no longer a place of order, it was a nightmare. The most dangerous breaches. The containment breaches had escalated to catastrophic levels. SCPs long held in reinforced chambers now roamed freely, their presence transforming the facility into a war zone. C-96, the Shy Guy, had broken free, its mournful wails echoing through the halls. Anyone unlucky enough to glimpse its face directly or through distorted reflections on cracked monitors met an inevitable and gruesome end. Blood trails marked its path as it tore through personnel in blind rage. SCP-H637434. SCP-1773, the infamous statue, moved with impossible speed, exploiting every blink and moment of inattention. It left behind a wake of broken bodies, their necks twisted at grotesque angles. As Sector 82, the indestructible reptile, rampaged through Sector Epsilon, its massive bulk demolishing walls and barriers. Security teams fought valiantly, but their efforts only seemed to enrage it further. But the most unsettling phenomenon was occurring in Sector Delta, where a reality-bending SCP, an anomaly designated SCP, had destabilized entirely. A swirling rift had formed in its containment chamber, a yawning vortex of black and violet that radiated energy strong enough to warp the surrounding area. The rift pulsed and expanded, consuming everything in its path. The rift's influence. As the rift grew, its effects rippled outward, distorting the very fabric of reality. Time loops and fragmentation. Some staff reported being caught in time loops, reliving the same moments over and over. Others found themselves frozen in place, unable to move or speak while the world shifted around them. Ethereal distortion. Entire rooms vanished or were replaced by incomprehensible voids. Hallways stretched into infinite tunnels, and doors opened into dimensions filled with impossible geometries. Paranormal manifestations, shadows, took on a life of their own, writhing along the walls like living things. Faint cries and whispers echoed through the air, growing louder as one approached the rift. The rift's pull was inexorable, and it threatened to consume the entire facility. The staff who hadn't succumbed to madness or death were fleeing toward the outermost blast doors, desperate for escape. Staff madness. SCP-51's whispers were no longer confined to Miriam, or even the immediate vicinity of the doll. They resonated throughout the facility, infecting the minds of anyone who heard them for too long. Staff members turned on each other, their paranoia and fear stoked by the doll's malevolent influence. In the medical bay, a doctor attempted to stab a nurse, claiming she was a vessel for the spirits. The nurse, bleeding and cornered, fought back, her screams echoing through the halls. Why? A security team tasked with containing SCP-173 turned their weapons on one another, after one of them accused the others of conspiring with the anomalies. Researchers locked themselves in rooms, carving symbols into the walls and their own flesh, chanting incoherently about the reckoning and cleansing the vessel. Dot clenched against the wall. Even Victor, usually calm and composed, gritted his teeth against the whispers. "They're everywhere," he muttered, his hand tightening around his weapon. "I can barely think. How are you holding it together?" Miriam didn't answer. The whispers were louder for her than anyone else, but the child's voice within her provided a fragile buffer, a faint but vital lifeline. The rift reaches its peak. Miriam and Victor finally reached Sector Delta, where the reality-bending rift was tearing through the facility. The sight before them was unlike anything they had ever seen. The rift churned and pulsed. A swirling mass of darkness shot through with veins of glowing violet. Its edges warped and undulated, sending out waves of energy that rippled through the walls, dissolving them into nothingness. Objects and people too close to the rift were dragged into its depths, their forms stretching and distorting before vanishing entirely. Around the rift, staff members stood frozen, their faces blank and unseeing. Some reached out toward the vortex, as if entranced, while others collapsed, their bodies crumbling into ash. Victor grabbed Miriam's arm. "We can't get any closer," he said. "That thing'll tear us apart." Miriam shook her head, her expression resolute. "This is where it's happening. The anomalies, the breaches, they're all connected to the rift. And the rift is connected to SCP-51. She turned to Victor, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We have to finish this. Now." The whisper's final demand. As they stood on the precipice of destruction, SCP-51's voice surged in Miriam's mind, drowning out everything else. "Complete the prayer. Sacrifice the vessel. Seal the rift." The child's voice returned, trembling but determined. "Don't believe it. The prayer won't stop the rift. It will feed it. The spirits want to be free. If you finish the prayer, they will be—" Miriam clutched her stomach, tears streaming down her face. She was caught between two impossible choices: complete the prayer and risk unleashing the full force of the spirits, or refuse and let the rift consume everything. Risking the loss of her family, Miriam began to take deep noracaprinogen daily. Victor stepped in front of her, his eyes fierce. "Miriam, whatever you choose, I'm with you. But you need to decide now." Miriam took a shaky breath, her heart pounding. The fate of the facility, perhaps the entire world, rested in her hands. He continued his silent approach, and she knew there was no turning back. Chapter 17. The Paradox Birth. The rift pulsed violently, sending another wave of energy rippling through the facility. The lights flickered and died, leaving Miriam and Victor in near total darkness, save for the ominous glow of the rift and the faint, pulsing light emanating from Miriam's abdomen. Miriam collapsed to her knees, clutching her stomach as pain racked her body. She cried out, her breath shallow and uneven, as the whispers surged to a deafening crescendo in her mind.
My dad.
Protect the vessel, birth the child, end the reckoning. Victor knelt beside her, panic flashing across his face. Miriam, what's happening? She gasped, her voice choked with pain. It's coming. The baby. It's coming. Elaine, the birth begins. Victor froze for a moment, then sprang into action. He quickly cleared his space on the trembling floor and helped Miriam lie down as gently as possible. The chaos around them seemed distant. The roar of the rift muted against Miriam's ragged breathing, and the whispers that now seemed to echo from every surface. This isn't possible, Victor muttered, his hands shaking. You're only a few weeks in. How can you? It's not normal, Miriam snapped through gritted teeth, her face contorted in pain. You think I don't know that? Just help me. The glow from her abdomen grew brighter, the veins beneath her skin pulsing like a heartbeat. Miriam cried out as the pain reached its peak, her body trembling uncontrollably. The whispers crescendoed, their tone shifting to one of anticipation and triumph. Birth the vessel, complete the cycle. With one final scream, Miriam felt a sudden release, and the world seemed to pause. A faint, otherworldly cry pierced the air, silencing the whispers for the first time since they'd begun. The paradox child. Victor stared in awe as the newborn emerged, its tiny body glowing faintly with an unearthly light. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and the veins beneath it pulsed with a soft, golden hue. The child's eyes, wide and unblinking, glowed faintly, reflecting the swirling energy of the rift. Samo said that when you were better, the room seemed to hold its breath as the baby let out another cry. The effect was immediate and profound. An almost palpable wave of calm radiated outward from the infant, washing over the chaos. End of poem. In Sector Gamma, SCP-96 ceased its wailing and lowered its head, retreating into a corner. SCP-173, poised mid-mation in a blood-soaked hallway, froze completely, as if caught in stasis. Even SCP-6082, mid-rampage, stopped its destruction, its massive form settling into a tense but motionless posture. The rift itself seemed to shrink slightly, its violent undulations slowing. For the first time in hours, the facility was still. The child's abilities. Miriam stared at her child, her breathing ragged but steady. The baby's glow illuminated her face, and for a moment, all she could feel was awe. Despite its unnatural appearance, there was something undeniably human in its tiny features. Victor crouched beside her, his expression a mixture of amazement and unease. It stopped them, he said, his voice hushed. The SCPs, it calmed them. How is that even possible? Before Miriam could answer, the baby turned its glowing eyes toward SCP-51, still perched on its pedestal. The doll's faint light flared violently, its influence surging once more. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Finish the prayer. Sacrifice the child. Fulfill the purpose. Miriam clutched the baby tightly, shielding it from the doll's influence. The whispers seemed to thrum in her skull, pressing down on her like a physical weight. The doll's intensified influence. As SCP-51's glow grew brighter, the facility began to tremble again. The temporary calm provided by the child's presence was beginning to unravel. Staff members across the facility, momentarily freed from the doll's influence, now fell deeper into madness. Researchers clawed at their faces, screaming about cleansing the vessel. And security personnel turned on one another, convinced their colleagues were agents of the spirits. The anomalies that had been subdued began stirring again, their containment faltering as SCP-51's power surged. The rift expanded once more, its edges crackling with unstable energy. Victor grabbed Miriam's arm, his voice urgent. "We have to do something, Miriam. That thing," he pointed to SCP-51, "is going to destroy everything if we don't stop it." The child's warning. The child's soft glow brightened, and Miriam felt its presence in her mind again. Its voice was clearer now, stronger. "Do not trust the doll," it said. "Its purpose is destruction. It will devour me to unleash the spirits. If it succeeds, the rift will consume everything." Miriam tightened her grip on the baby, her heart pounding. "But how do I stop it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do I do?" The child's voice was calm, almost reassuring. "I can hold the anomalies back, but not for long. You must destroy the vessel. Only then will the cycle end." Miriam's eyes darted to SCP-51, its malevolent glow almost blinding now. The whispers were deafening, urging her to complete the prayer, to give in to the doll's demands. "No matter." Victor placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "Miriam," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever you're hearing, whatever you're feeling, we need to decide. Now." Mother's resolve. Miriam looked down at her child, its tiny form radiating a warmth that steadied her. The choice before her was agonizing. Trust the child, an anomaly born of the chaos, or trust SCP-51, the object at the heart of the facility's collapse. The whispers screamed, "Sacrifice the vessel, finish the prayer." "Ho-ho." The child's voice, soft but unwavering, whispered, "Destroy the doll. End the cycle." Taking a deep breath, Miriam rose to her feet, cradling the baby in one arm. She turned to SCP-51, its glow pulsing wildly, as if anticipating her next move. She made her decision. Chapter 18. Completing the prayer. The chamber trembled under the strain of the rift's expanding presence. SCP-51 sat on its pedestal, its hollow eyes glowing brighter with each passing moment, pulsating in time with the whispers that filled the air. Miriam stood at the center of it all, cradling the paradoxical child, who had calmed the anomalies but now faced an impossible fate. Victor paced the room, his hand never leaving the grip of his weapon, his eyes darting between SCP-51 and the rift. "Miriam, whatever you're going to do, you need to do it now," he said urgently. "This place won't hold much longer." Miriam nodded, her mind racing. The whispers were louder than ever, overlapping and insistent. They urged her to finish the prayer, to fulfill the purpose of the vessel. But beneath their cacophony, the child's voice spoke softly in her mind. Miriam looked up at the stars and the sky, ready to find the answer, to trust the wisdom of the universe that was always as clear as the sky. "The prayer is the key," it said. "You must piece it together, but know the cost. War is the price of peace." Reconstructing the incantation. Incantation. Miriam knelt before SCP-51A, the fragmented rice paper that had consumed her research. Her fingers hovered over the faded characters, now almost completely indecipherable. But her visions of the past and the child's presence in her mind helped her bridge the gaps. The ancient woman's voice from her visions echoed in her thoughts, guiding her. She spoke of binding and sacrifice, of spirits sealed within the vessel. Miriam began to recite the incantation, her voice trembling as she matched the fragments to her memory. "Into this vessel," she whispered, her words steadying as the glow of SCP-51 brightened. "Let the wicked spirits dwell. Bind them to its form, that they may not walk this earth." The child's voice interjected gently. "There is more, Mother. The price must be spoken." Miriam hesitated, her heart pounding. She glanced down at her child, its glowing eyes meeting hers with a strange mixture of serenity and sorrow. "Through sacrifice," she continued, tears streaming down her face, "the curse is broken. By this binding, life is traded for life. The vessel will hold as long as the anchor remains." Victor froze mid-step. Miriam choked back a sob. "It means the child has to die. It's the anchor, the cost of completion." The whispers surged, almost jubilant, as if they sensed her growing resolve. SCP-51 pulsed in response, the glow of its hollow eyes now almost blinding. The rift's expansion slowed, as though it too awaited her next move. The child's voice was calm, soothing. "This is what I was created for, Mother. I am the anchor. Without me, the binding cannot hold." Miriam shook her head, clutching the baby tighter. "There has to be another way. There has to be." The witch's head vibrated. "Waiting?" "There isn't," the child said gently. "If the spirits are not contained, they will consume everything. The anomalies, the breaches, the rift, it will all spread until nothing remains." Carl smiled. "We should learn from our mistakes," he said, making sure his words caught. Victor stepped forward, his expression hard. "Miriam, listen to me. You don't have to do this. We'll figure something out. "There's no time," Miriam snapped, her voice breaking. "Don't you understand? It's either my child or the world." Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right.
Like right.
A mother's choice? Miriam turned back to SCP-51, her resolve hardening. The child's light pulsed gently, as if giving her strength. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her tears falling onto the child's glowing skin. "I love you." "Yeah, and I love you, Mother," the child replied, its voice filled with quiet acceptance. "Thank you for protecting me. Now, let me protect you." With trembling hands, Miriam placed the child on SCP-51's pedestal. The doll's glow flared, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. Miriam raised her voice over the chaos, reciting the final lines of the incantation. "By this sacrifice, the spirits are bound. By this vessel, they shall never walk this earth." The room shook violently, the rift crackling with unstable energy. The child's glow intensified, its golden light merging with the doll's cold, ivory brilliance. Miriam stepped back, her heart shattering as the child's form began to fade. She somehow continued to step forward. "Goodbye, Mother," it said, its voice soft and serene. The binding completes. The moment the child vanished, a blinding light filled the chamber. SCP-51 absorbed the energy, its hollow eyes glowing brighter than ever. The whispers ceased, replaced by a profound silence. The rift shuddered, then collapsed in on itself, the swirling mass of energy imploding with a deafening roar. The anomalies across the facility stilled, their breaches closing as the containment systems reactivated. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the facility was quiet. Aftermath. Miriam collapsed to her knees, the weight of her decision crushing her. SCP-51 sat silently on its pedestal, its glow now faint but steady. The child was gone, its presence a memory that burned in her chest like an open wound. Victor crouched beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You did it," he said, though his voice was hollow. "You saved us." Miriam didn't respond. She stared at SCP-51, her vision blurred by tears. The price had been too high. "I didn't save anyone," she whispered. "I just delayed the inevitable." Corin sprang awake. Victor helped her to her feet, and the two of them left the chamber, the weight of the sacrifice hanging heavily between them. I thought, but as they walked away, neither noticed the faint pulse of light that emanated from SCP-051, a subtle rhythmic glow, like the beating of a tiny heart. Chapter 19. The Sacrifice. The chamber trembled violently as the rift in Sector Delta continued to expand, consuming everything in its path. The once calm anomalies, temporarily subdued by the child's presence, began stirring again. Time was running out, and the choice Miriam had dreaded since the moment she learned the truth now stood before her, inevitable and crushing. SCP-051 pulsed with its eerie glow, its hollow eyes fixed on her, as if aware of what was to come. The whispers, which had grown louder and more insistent, now faded into a single, unified voice. The secretary for the military sadistic procedure. "Finish the prayer. Sacrifice the child. Seal the spirits." Miriam cradled her glowing child in her arms, its soft light flickering weakly. The baby gazed up at her, its luminous eyes filled with a strange serenity, as though it understood what she could barely bring herself to say. The agonizing decision. The big man nodded slightly and arranged his scalp tap, peering carefully at the dead creature's terrifying face. Victor stood beside her, his face pale but resolute. "Miriam," he said softly, "you've already stopped the rift once. The baby, it can't hold this much longer. You know what has to happen." Miriam's breath hitched, her arms tightening protectively around the child. "There has to be another way," she said, her voice breaking. "This isn't fair. I can't—" The child's voice, soft but unwavering, filled her mind. "Mother, it's okay. This is my purpose. You've kept me safe. Now let me protect you," she said, brave. "My son?" she asked. Her knees buckled and she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. "You're not just a tool. You're not a sacrifice. You're my baby." "And I always will be," the child replied, its light glowing softly. "But the spirits must be bound. The world must be protected." Victor placed a hand on her shoulder, his own voice trembling. "You're the only one who can do this, Miriam. I'm sorry, but if you don't, it all ends here." Pleading the prayer, Miriam rose shakily to her feet, clutching the child close as she approached SCP-051. The whispers seemed to surround her, their tone shifting from demanding to almost reverent. "Mother and child," they intoned. "Complete the binding. Seal the vessel." Miriam placed the child gently on the pedestal, her fingers lingering on its glowing form. The baby's light grew brighter, casting long shadows across the room. SCP-051 began to pulse, its glow synchronizing with the baby's, the energy building with every passing moment. Through her tears, Miriam began reciting the prayer, her voice trembling but resolute. "Into this vessel let the wicked spirits dwell. Bind them to its form, that they may not walk this earth." The baby's light intensified, and SCP-051's glow flared in response. The room shook violently as the energy swirled around them, a storm of light and shadow. Through sacrifice, the curse is broken. By this binding, life is traded for life. The whispers grew deafening, merging into a single wordless cry as the energy reached its peak. Miriam's voice broke as she spoke the final words. "The vessel will hold. The anchor shall remain. The transfer A blinding flash filled the chamber as SCP-51 absorbed the child's essence. The baby's glow flickered, then surged, its light flowing into the doll like a stream of liquid fire. The child's cry echoed through the room, faint and haunting, before fading into silence. Miriam fell to her knees, her arms empty, her heart shattered. SCP-51 pulsed with a new, steady light, its hollow eyes now faintly luminous. The whispers ceased entirely, leaving behind a deafening stillness. The rift in Sector Delta collapsed, its swirling energy imploding with a final, echoing roar. Across the facility, the anomalies stilled, their containment stabilizing as the chaos came to an abrupt halt. The breaches were sealed, the site was saved. Aftermath. Victor helped Miriam to her feet, his expression grim. "It's over," he said quietly, though his voice lacked any sense of triumph. Miriam stared at SCP-51, her vision blurred by tears. The doll sat on its pedestal, unmoving, yet alive with the faint pulse of the child's essence. Her knees buckled again, and Victor caught her, guiding her to sit against the wall. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice hollow. I gave him up." Victor knelt beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You saved all of us," he said. "You saved the world." But the words were empty. Miriam's chest felt hollow, the weight of her decision crushing her. She had done what was necessary, but it had cost her everything. Sorry, Leo." The faint light. As they sat in silence, SCP-51's glow flickered faintly, its light soft and rhythmic, like the beating of a tiny heart. Miriam's breath caught as she felt a faint warmth in her chest, a fleeting echo of the child's presence. "Thank you, Mother." The voice whispered one last time, so faint she wasn't sure she'd heard it at all. Miriam closed her eyes, her tears falling freely. The sacrifice was complete, but the wound it left behind would never heal. She had saved the world, but in doing so she had lost her own. Chapter 20. Aftermath. The containment facility was eerily quiet, the chaos of the breach now a haunting memory. Cleanup crews worked tirelessly to repair the damage left in the wake of the catastrophe. Shattered walls were replaced, flickering lights restored, and the remaining staff, those who had survived, moved like ghosts, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. At the center of the devastation sat SCP-51. Recovered from its chamber, it was placed under maximum observation. The once oppressive whispers that had infected the facility were gone, leaving behind an unnerving silence. SCP-51's change. SCP-582. Dr. Victor Harlow stood with his arms crossed in the observation room overlooking SCP-51's new containment chamber. The doll sat in its reinforced glass case, unchanged at first glance, but closer inspection revealed subtle, chilling details. The doll's hollow eyes, once empty and lifeless, now shimmered faintly, as though holding a trace of light. Its face, carved with meticulous detail, seemed softer somehow, its expression less neutral, almost tender. The features were no longer entirely generic. There was an undeniable resemblance to the child Miriam had lost. Doll's scans, frowned, and paused for a moment before revealing the dolls. "Sir, have you noticed this?" she asked, pointing to the screen. "The structure of SCP-51. It's been altered. The facial features are humanized." Victor didn't respond immediately, his jaw tightening. "Keep it under observation. Log everything. Every flicker, every change." The researcher hesitated. "Do you think it's aware? You're aware of how you transfer your energies?" Victor didn't answer. He didn't want to speculate on what SCP-51 might now be. Miriam's isolation. In the medical wing, Miriam lay motionless in a sterile bed. Her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, unseeing. The once brilliant fire of her intellect and determination had dimmed, snuffed out by the weight of her sacrifice. Apple and Saren laid next to her, reading the airless manuscript, until Apple quickly bent down to read. A nurse entered the room quietly, adjusting the IV line and checking Miriam's vitals. She spoke softly, but there was no response. Miriam hadn't spoken since the sacrifice. She barely moved, her body alive, but her spirit hollow. Victor entered moments later, his face grim. He pulled a chair to her bedside, sitting in silence for a long while before finally speaking. "Yeah, you saved us all, Miriam," he said, his voice rough. "The world is safe because of you, but I know that doesn't make it any easier." Miriam didn't react. Her hands lay limp on the blanket, her eyes still fixed on the ceiling. Victor sighed, rubbing his temples. "They're putting you under observation by psychological evaluation. You'll be here until they think you're ready to leave." He paused, his voice softening. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here." He stayed for a while longer before finally leaving, his shoulders heavy with guilt. Dolls whispered. Back in the containment chamber, SCP-51 sat undisturbed under constant surveillance. Researchers monitored it in shifts, taking notes on every detail, though it remained eerily silent and still. Late that night, the lead researcher on duty leaned closer to the observation monitor, frowning. The doll's glow, faint and rhythmic, pulsed again, a pattern so subtle it was almost imperceptible. "Bunwit's the last name. Is it just me?" she asked aloud, "or is that like a heartbeat?" Her assistant looked up from his station, squinting at the screen. "I thought I was imagining it," he admitted, "but yeah, it's steady." The room fell silent as the two stared at the doll. Its faint pulse, hypnotic. Then the audio feed crackled. The speaker began to fail. At first it was nothing, a faint hum. Static. But then a sound emerged. A single word, soft and whispered, spoken in a voice that seemed far too human. "Mother." The researchers froze, their blood running cold. They stared at each other, then back at the doll. It remained still, its faint glow steady, as though it had never spoken. A lingering presence. In her room, Miriam stirred for the first time in hours. Her chest felt heavy, as if something unseen pressed against her heart. She closed her eyes, and for the briefest moment she thought she felt it. A warmth, faint and fleeting, like the echo of a child's touch. Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes as she whispered into the silence of the room. "I'm sorry." Somewhere in the depths of the facility, SCP-51's glow pulsed faintly in response. The end. The Foundation's logs on SCP-51 were updated. Object status active. Features altered. Anomalous activity stabilized. Further observation required. Remove the object. But those who worked closest with SCP-51 knew the truth. Something remained within the vessel, not just the spirits, not just the anomalies, but a presence. Something that had once been a child, and perhaps still was. And though the facility returned to its sterile routine, those who ventured too close to SCP-51 swore they could hear it whispering softly. Always the same word.